Reversed.
Greetings, I'm Shad, and I've been thinking a little bit lately about the role of the fantasy adventurer, specifically the medieval fantasy adventurer, and how would that actually play out if we try and look at it from a more realistic point of view, which is why this is another episode in Fantasy Rearmed, because that's what we do in Fantasy Rearmed. We try and have a look at just fantasy tropes and just see, alright, what's a different kind of take on it, and usually that different take is a more realistic approach. Doesn't mean you have to do it this way. Everything in Fantasy Rearmed is kind of like an example, just to show this is how we can look at things from a different point of view to make it interesting, possibly more realistic, and encourage everyone to perhaps try and approach these same things in the same way. So the adventurer is an interesting kind of role, task, I think. They're the quintessential and probably the primary aspect to medieval fantasy because the protagonists, the main characters, are adventurers. This is in D&D, but also many fantasy literature and stuff. Now, in fantasy literature, usually these characters are driven to their adventuring in a more organic kind of approach. There is a catalyst type of event, a call to action that sends them on their journey. That's a little bit different to a world in which the role or job of an adventurer is kind of an established thing and understood by the general people, which is usually what you get in, say, Dungeons and Dragons and other fantasy like that. Now, certain fantasies that use that trope as an adventurer as kind of like a common job or role, I really enjoy it. It's fun. They did it in Goblin Slayer, and Goblin Slayer is actually a really interesting example of taking many strict kind of D&D-like fantasy tropes, even the magic system, into like a setting in which they try and apply them in a more realistic way. Content warning for Goblin Slayer. I already have 2 videos on Goblin Slayer if you're interested. But separate to calls to actions and inciting incidences that send individuals on quests, I'd much rather like to kind of discuss what are the conditions that would encourage the role or job of the adventurer as a more common thing. Separate individuals, but as a thing that you would expect to find in the modern day. And if there were those events that would encourage adventurers, what would they actually look like? Would they look like the D&D fantasy adventurer, or would they be kind of different? The way that we can determine this is, 1, look at the things that encourage adventuring. And I think there are 2 clear, very big ones. Monsters and treasure. Okay? They'll search for fortune and everything. So, looking at those 2, if we take a generic fantasy world with monsters, but also great treasure, ruins with ancient magics and whatever things, would that bring about the adventurers as we kind of see them? I'm not necessarily so sure about that, actually, because if we were to take such a world, we can get insight or input as to what people would naturally more respond to from history. And I really feel the fighting monsters and the looking for adventure would create 2 different kind of roles, and they wouldn't uniformly just create adventure. We'd actually have 2 more distinct types of groups. And so before we get on the dealing with the monsters, I'll go back on the adventuring actual thing, because that's the term, the adventurer, people that go on adventures. Well, when we look to history, we see people that love to go on hunts, safaris and stuff, and these were generally more wealthy people that wanted something fun to do and they had the money and resources to do it. We've also had expeditions, people going on in searches, potentially for new lands, but also there were rich people. In actual fact, they're the people that the Downton Abbey show was originally based upon. I forget their name. But this wealthy aristocrat actually used his money to go on expeditions into Egypt and discover Egyptian relics and things. And he actually helped push forward certain archaeological endeavours. And what we're seeing here is that there seems to be the role more so of the rich than of the poor, historically speaking. Though there is another example where all people from all walks of life, in actual fact it's more representative of the poor, would go on a type of adventure, and that's when fortune could be found, and it was said to usually be easier to achieve than in their regular jobs. And we see this more so, historically, in the nature of the gold rush. When people heard that there's a place with gold everywhere and you can just basically walk along the ground and just pick it up from the ground, easy money, easy riches, fortune right there, that made a massive influx of people to go. There would be some caveats in a fantasy setting, of course, because it depends on how easy this treasure adventure is. But already we have certain examples that we're drawing from historically. One is the idea of just going off on an adventure because you have the means and resources to do it, but success, riches, are not actually guaranteed. In actual fact, it's going to be harder to achieve fortune this way than other more mundane things that you do at home, or it requires so many resources to even go on such an endeavor that only the rich can try and do it. So in that type of adventure, you could apply it in a fantasy setting where an ancient ruin was discovered, but it's a long journey and you need a lot of resources, manpower, equipment to reach there and to do what you need to do when you get there. And so that would take a lot more organization than a band of plucky heroes just grabbing some weapons, a few resources, and going off. But if the riches were said to be much easier, you just need to go there and you can find treasure and stuff, and depending on how big the treasure is, of course, that would cause people to be willing to risk certain things and not be nearly as organized as other things, but you would almost see a different kind of tier of adventurers. You could have this small group of adventurers, but if the riches were truly significant, in a medieval fantasy setting, it'd be actually vastly more realistic to have larger organized expeditions by kings and nobles sending off. In actual fact, they might be looking for capable people who have capable of certain tasks. So the classic adventuring archetype, but basically warriors, magic users, rogues, any person that can, you know, fulfill important tasks, healers, all that stuff, that are more likely be getting hired by people who could perhaps organize larger expeditions and stuff, and they would be going off on the quests to receive great wealth from ancient ruins and things. Both could logically exist. The smaller band of adventurers doing on their own, but already we're seeing unique examples that can open up opportunities for adventure. A really fun, classic and well-known book series that actually is framed much around classic fantasy tropes is Dragonlance, for example, where you have a band of adventurers, but they do really have the bigger inciting incident where they were just a more plucky band of adventurers in their past, but then something larger happens and they're called to try and combat larger, you know, problems and things. And so if you're actually interested in checking out Dragonlance, there's a way you can get it for free because, as luck would have it, this video is sponsored by Audible. All you need to do is go to www.audible.com/Shadowversity, or if you're in the US, you type Shadowversity to 500, sign up for your first month, you get your first audiobook for free, and I would recommend Dragonlance, such a classic fun fantasy, and then you also get access to the Audible Plus catalog, and this gives you a huge amount of content right out of the gate, from select audiobooks, but also podcasts, self-help books, sleep tracks, all this content right out of the gate. And when you sign up, you get your first 30 days completely free. Free audiobook and free access for the Audible Plus catalog for a full 30 days before you even need to pay the first monthly subscription, which is very affordable. And by the way, that monthly subscription then gives you a credit that you can trade for any audiobook in Audible. And that monthly credit is far cheaper than many of the retail costs of the audiobook. Look at my own audiobook, Shadow of the Conqueror. The retail cost is a lot more than this monthly credit. And so you can get access to such awesome content. Audiobooks are brilliant. I really do. I recommend it. I love them. My son has just been getting into them and he's addicted, basically. He's been going through Skyward by Brandon Sanderson, a really fun sci-fi fantasy, kind of like dogfighting in space. It's so good. I loved it and he's hooked now. He just listens to it when we send him off to bed because we don't want him playing on the games, but okay, listen to audiobook while I sleep, and then that's end up keeping him awake until 10 at night because he just gets hooked. So anyway, audiobooks are great, really recommend it, and you can dive right in at such a great deal, great cost, get your first audiobook free. Recommend Dragonlance, www.audible.com/Shadowversity, or text Shadowversity to 500 if you're in the US. So now let's look back at the concept idea of the adventurer. We've mainly been talking about looking for riches or literally adventure, go off on an adventure. So what about that aspect? Because we actually haven't addressed that. We were addressing the going off for riches because riches can attract people from all walks of life, large expeditions, everything. But in terms of just adventure, like, you know, the rich people going on safari and stuff, well, you literally would have that, you know, for people that just want to go do something more interesting. Another example of a person just going off on a type of adventure is the concept of holidays. Actual traveling to go to some place that's more interesting, or they haven't seen everything, for an experience. That is a type of adventurer, okay? World travelers are types of modern-day adventurers, not in the classic fantasy sense, but they are looking for excitement, fun, something different. And historically, people from all walks of life did that. The classic idea of the pilgrimage often was a type of holiday for many commoner to go see the world, travel, meet new people, and see something really interesting. And so oftentimes it was perhaps like a religious relic. Would that really create the classic type of fantasy adventurer? This is where we get to the different aspect in medieval fantasy versus the historical one, is that medieval fantasy have monsters, and travelling might not be the safest thing. I already have a video on addressing how monsters would affect the fantasy world, which you probably want to take the things we talk about in that video, combine it with the things we're talking about in this video, because monsters affect a world vastly so, and free travel would be a big impact. So depending on how prevalent monsters are, rarely would people just be travelling alone, like farmers just with their produce on their wagon to sell in the next town. You would have to have like large armed escorts and groups. Like there would be, the role of an escort would be like a permanent job where you travel from town to town at a set time, and if you wanted a safe journey, you have to get to the time when they're just happening, and so they could do it in a kind of economically viable way to get from point A to point B safely. So if monsters are that much of a problem, travelling anywhere without armed protection could be a problem. That could completely nullify the possibility of the common folk going on holidays and venturing in that sense, or if they ever tried to, they would want to know how to fight. And that could give rise to the fantasy type adventure, but that's a lot of work to just travel the world a bit for fun. Usually you would need something more significant to cause someone to change their entire life's profession to know how to fight competently, become like a classic D&D character type, for the off chance that they might like to travel now and then. No, that would be an actual role. This is a job, it's an occupation. And if that's the case, that leads to other interesting manifestations that we can draw from history in terms of how the combative warrior-type adventurer would actually look like. What are they doing? How do they support themselves when they're not looking for riches or fighting monsters? This is where we come to the concept of a mercenary. If they have the skills, well, then they'd be trying to use them to make a living. And more often, if we were to look at this more historically, okay, people need to support themselves. The adventurer whose entire occupation is revolved around the capacity to freely travel in a world infested with monsters, perhaps in groups or even by themselves would be more difficult, they would more often fall into the role of mercenaries versus the plucky person who just travels and then what justifies them developing their skills. Now, the thing is though, being a mercenary, if we were to take it from a more historical perspective, is a more complex kind of thing than just, hey, I've got these skills, I'm going to be a mercenary. It usually attracts a certain type of personality more commonly than other types. And they're not always the most savoury or best people. Mercenary groups historically were often very cutthroat and not very nice groups. I mean, there are some pretty severe bad atrocities caused by mercenary groups that grew too big for anyone to try and control them. There are situations when mercenary groups are hired, promised money, and then the money wasn't delivered, and they still need to get paid, and so they just go on raiding sprees in the surrounding area, sacking everything to get the money that they felt that they were entitled to, they weren't getting, and they just end up robbing and sacking and pillaging surrounding land. It happened to Rome, right?
189. This is a bad thing.
I love that song, man. Just listen to Sabaton, The Last Stand, to get some historical context. Like one of my favourite songs of all time. But the whole story behind that song, the historical context, is an army of mercenaries that were left high and dry by the people that hired them, and they're like, "What are we gonna do, lads? Rome's over there. Let's capture the Pope." And they did some and the historical record accounts them doing some horrific, we're talking about raping nuns on altars, bad stuff, okay?
Hey, when in Rome, do as the Romans did.
I think that that was more consensual. This is the thing, though. The idea of someone who is going to learn to be able to fight and kill things really effectively and then choose to do it as a living, these are, like, that's a life that does not attract the wholesome, I want to settle down, raise a family, and live a good, happy life type of people. And even if, you know, you can get good, honourable men being mercenaries, I'm not saying it's impossible, but would that be the more common type of person that would end up doing that job? We don't generally see that historically, just in the larger trend. And I'm not saying all of them were bad, but they're at least more aggressive, a bit more rougher. These are like their career soldiers. This is separate to, oh, my country is under attack and I'm going to take up arms to defend my family or to protect the Holy Land or any noble call to action. These are guys that are good at killing, good at warfare, and they want to get paid for it. That does have certain application to the adventurer. And I really feel a more realistic result is that you would actually see a larger representation of these cutthroat mercenary. That's where the literal term, that's very mercenary of you, like, comes from, where it's cutthroat, it's aggressive, it's, you know, right in the face. I feel we would see more examples of this type of adventurer, far more so than the plucky band of heroes. There would be the exception to have them, but they usually do have a more noble call to action, like my country's under attack, there's a Dark Lord that needs to be defeated, a ring needs to be thrown into a volcano, and only this guy can resist the temptation and stuff. Or the Holy Land needs to be reclaimed, Dea's Vault. Look, there's a lot, okay? But in terms of just general warfare, yeah, mercenaries. But there is a more noble kind of role for the career warrior, and this could be the career, not necessarily warrior, but if they are a career wizard, of course you have many jobs that a wizard could fulfill, store everything, but in terms of traveling, if there are so many useful things that you can do in your local area and achieve great success in it, and you don't have to risk your life, wizards would more often fill those kind of roles, councils to kings and all those things, than constantly going out fighting monsters. The monster clearing thing would actually, mercenaries, adventurers, and they would almost use like, you know, there's this village and they're constantly being hounded by a horde of goblins, and then this mercenary group of adventurers come by and say, we can deal with them for you, you just need to pay the right amount. If not, we'll let him slaughter you all. You know, so there would be a lot of villages in that difficult situation, but this is where I come to the more noble role that could arise, because the way that villagers could try and deal with that and not have to be extorted by cutthroat mercenaries would be by the role of the local champion or local hero, all right? The strongest man in the village who ended up, you know, just reaching the top, being like, they got attacked by goblins. There was one guy that turned out, whoa, you took care of those goblins really good. And when the goblins attack, as a natural result of your success last time, people are going to be looking to you for protection. And then they'll regularly look to you. That could actually be your job, your role. You become the local champion, the village champion, the local hero who is there to protect the village. And that, I actually feel, now, of course, you'd have, like, there's local militias and things. But in terms of the fantasy world, where you have these roles that individuals can take upon them as their occupation and then grow to a much greater level of competence than the average Joe who's a member of the militia and he has his pitchfork next to him, if these roles existed in a more historical lens, and people can naturally fall into them just by ending up fighting in the process of events and everything, something that's far more realistic in my mind is not necessarily going off on adventures, because people have ties wherever you grow up. You have family, you have friends, you have property that you own that you become attached to. I love living in my home, all right? And when I travel, you know, one of the things that I like most is coming back home, right? Look, there are people who just don't like traveling. I'm one of them. And even if, I think this would reflect in the world, because even people that don't like traveling, we all have our homes. And if you have your central location where you live and you have all these skills of fighting monsters, you're the role, you're a fighter or a ranger or a barbarian or any number of those things, okay? The local people are definitely going to be looking to you if there's any issues that are arising. And if they can actually fulfill their needs, be employed in their local area through operating their occupation, I think vastly more adventurers would prefer to operate as adventurers in their local area than going on these long quests, unless there's obviously an inciting incident that calls for it, or maybe opportunity, great adventure. But outside of those, I think more often you would have the concept of the local hero adventurer, maybe local adventuring group. So instead of like adventuring guilds that rely on travelling adventurers, the plucky band of heroes that just come upon them and it's like, oh, we are looking for quests, sir. No, that would be more mercenary types. You would not have the local guild looking for outsiders. You would have a local adventuring group that solely operates in their town village, and they're known, they have ties there, they have houses, family, property, all those things. That's actually a vastly more realistic kind of result when we look at this. If we look at, okay, what are people like? What do they do with their occupation? Like all those things. And that is, again, another opportunity for great conflict, because adventurers, just by the operation of adventuring, you know, they defeat a big bad goblin, they would get some type of recognition for it. They're known for being tough. They might end up being vastly stronger than even the local militia. And adventurers can get so darn tough that they can take on weak armies, basically. To the point there that they either might be offered certain roles, influence, stations of power in the local area, or if they're somewhat morally dubious, they might extort or demand it, and going kind of like on the mercenary route, but they could do it in a more subtle, clever way to gain influence, to the point where the leaders of these areas, the true ones that become the nobles and everything, could be the adventurers, and that could even corrupt certain groups to end up extorting them. It's like, all right, you rely on me for protection, I'm gonna live in this castle, I've got the money, I've defeated all this thing, and build a castle right next to the village, and look, I mean, if you want me to stick around and protect you, you just got to give me a monthly, you know, stipend wage or anything, and that could increase to the point where they could end up extorting protection money. And look at that! Protection money! Have we seen that done historically? So if monsters were around, adventurers, you know, dubious, you know, immoral kind of ventures could end up operating like organised crime in gangs, in there, like extorting their local populace, because they're stronger, they're more powerful, but also they're the ones who deals with adventurers. And then you have conflict, and that's already a story. You could have a whole story just around this whole village of this village, it could be a sizable village, somewhat large, trying to find reliable local people capable of protecting them from the threats around them, and they relied on one, they became corrupt, and now they're exploiting the village, and the new thing wants to try and, you know, take them out, or they say, we'll protect you, don't need to give them, and the ones in power get annoyed, and they tell conflict, story. Heaps of fun that you could explore here. And these are just some examples when we try and analyse what would a fantasy adventurer actually be like in a more realistic lens. What are your thoughts? I'd love to read them. Please do share them in the comments below, because you can keep going with this idea, keep exploring, and there are other ideas that I'm sure I haven't mentioned. So I look forward to reading what you have to say. Thank you very much for watching. Hope to see you on the next video, and until that time, farewell.